My name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, and we're delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Earl Turner, who will be talking with you about how to raise resilient Black kids in a complex world. Please join me, everyone, in a really warm welcome for Dr. Earl Turner. Thank you, Dr. Turner.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this topic tonight. And as you mentioned, it's definitely a very timely topic. It's also been something that I think for many of us, we've had these conversations about this, for a really long time. And so it's not something that's necessarily new for us, but I do think that it is important for us to talk about this and how to raise resilient Black kids in this particular society and times that we're living in. I have some information here on this slide. I know that I've seen some links and things pop up in the chat, but for those that may be interested in connecting with me or connecting with Therapy for Black Kids, you can scan the QR code here. It'll take you to my website, which features a bunch of links to connect with Therapy for Black Kids on social media. You can also connect with Black Kids Thrive on Instagram as well, which is primarily a page that is utilized to share information and resources related to the book and topics that I discussed in the book as well. So a brief disclaimer here, as was noted, I will be talking about my book today. Wanted to note that if there are books that are purchased, I will potentially receive royalties from that. And so I wanted to note that no other financial conflicts of interest to note here. So just a reminder, obviously there has already been a mention about the Q&A and being able to post your comments to engage. I also wanted to remind people to take care of themselves as needed. So this could be potentially emotionally charging at times throughout the conversation today. So I want you to, take the time that you need. I have a short little reminder for a breathing exercise here on the slide, which is the 4-4-4, which basically is you breathe in for 4, you hold it for 4 seconds, and then you breathe out for 4 seconds. And so I'm going to demonstrate that here. If you want to engage in that with me as well, feel free to do so if you choose. Again, I think it is helpful to sort of recognize these physiological changes that may be going on in our bodies. And this also might be something that you could be able to utilize with your child as well. So again, breathe in for 4, hold it for 4, and then breathe out for 4. So breathe in, hold it, and breathe out. So again, feel free to use this as you choose tonight or at some other time points if you feel like you may need something to help you regulate your body a little bit. So a couple of things for tonight in terms of what I hope you will leave here with. One of those is just being able to better understand what are some of the psychological effects of racism on Black youth. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit more about what are some strategies that you can utilize to help manage symptoms of racial stress among Black youth, as well as some of the other psychological concerns that may result after experiencing or witness racial discrimination. So on this slide, you will see a couple of news clips. And so I like to show these as a way for us to really recognize what are some of the challenges that Black youth in particular may experience. So for me as a child psychologist, I work closely with youth who navigate a very difficult world. And in some cases, the world is not always kind to them, especially for Black children. And so we know from these headlines here, as well as maybe your own individual experiences, that children experience racism within the school environment, which they spend a significant amount of their days. And they also experience these things within the community as well. So these headlines that are noted here really just highlight some of these experiences where Black youth may encounter racial hate or different forms of discrimination. Some of these experiences result in being bullied because of their race. Other times, youth may be profiled in public spaces. And oftentimes, these children carry these experiences in silence because they may be afraid to even talk about these with their parents. But the good news is that by providing kids with tools and support, we can help them to be more resilient. And your role as a parent and a family member is really significant in helping them to navigate these spaces. And so as individuals, we can help you to overcome some of these challenges that they may encounter by providing them support in terms of understanding who they are and celebrating their identity. We can make space for them to have really honest conversations about racism and about the emotions that they may experience. And we can also help them to get professional help or therapy as needed. And one of the things that I often talk about when it comes to therapy is that we want to understand that therapy is not a weakness and that it is something that can really be beneficial to helping you and your family navigate a number of different circumstances. And one of the reasons that I got into this work in particular was to help address some of the stigma within the Black community around therapy. And what I've seen over the years is that while there has been increased interest in going to therapy among the Black community, at times we also may feel that, therapy is not something that we do. And so while there has been some improvements in understanding the benefits of therapy, there still remains some stigma around utilizing those services. So before I talk about some of the psychological effects of racism, I want to show a brief clip. This video was produced by the American Psychological Association as a way to bring awareness to how racism and racial discrimination impacts multiple groups and communities, not just the Black community. And so I'm going to show a very brief clip of this and just sort of let you sort of see, for those that may sort of be unaware, what are some of the things that, individuals may encounter. So I'm going to try to jump ahead a little bit.
In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903.
For other people and for other situations to engage with you in ways that are not appropriate, to indeed say things or do things because of your particular race. It's not that your particular race is generating those particular stressors, and that's very important. The blame falls on the other people and situations and so on that cause those things, not you as the individual.
We go to these ideas like resilience as a way, which I appreciate those ideas, and they're helpful, but the responsibility for the alleviation of race-related stress is not within the individuals who experience it. This is our problem, all of us.
One of the experiences that stands out to me the most, that I think has affected me even into higher ed, was in high school. I had a class, I was an honors English class, and I grew up in a area that there's not a lot of minorities. There's maybe like 10 of us in my graduating class. So when I walked into the classroom in front of the whole class, the teacher asked me, was I in the wrong room? And I said no. And being in high school, I'm like checking my schedule, like, no, I think I'm in the right classroom. And so she said, no, this is an honors class. I don't think you're in the right room. And so I looked at my schedule and I looked around. And my mother used to be a teacher, and I have a bunch of siblings, so we've been through that high school. And I'm like, I recognize the people in this classroom. And so she looked at my schedule and then told me to have a seat. And for the rest of the semester, I got lower grades than everybody in the class, to the point that I had a partner who was not Black, who spoke up for me in class on a project. I literally got a lower grade than her, letter grade. And it got to the point where my mom had to go up to the school and they had to have a parent-teacher conference. But for me, it was just a really humiliating experience. Like, there wasn't anything that I did wrong. There wasn't anything that I could have done differently. And I felt like it left a stain on me for in every educational endeavor. I always feel like I need to prove that I need to be there.
When you
In his
So
book, The
the reason
Souls
that
of the
I like to show this video is to just bring up the awareness about why it's important to have these conversations. And one of those is that we need to first acknowledge the history of injustice and oppression within this country. But I think this video also highlights that while we've made some improvements as a country, there still remains injustice that needs to be addressed. And so it is mindful for us to think about, one, how our children are being impacted by these experiences, but also what can we do to better support them as well in our families and in communities and in society. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the psychological impacts of racism. Discrimination and racism are talked about a lot, and I think we have this awareness about it being a social issue that needs to be addressed. But we also want to recognize that these are also mental health issues. And so when our children experience racism, both either directly or indirectly, it can deeply affect how they see themselves and how they see the world around them. In terms of the research, we know that there are both short-term and long-term effects on mental and physical health. Some of the short-term effects for children might include feelings of fear, shame, sometimes anger. It might result in trouble sleeping or having difficulties focusing. It can also lead to increases in anxiety and sadness. We also know long-term effects can be even more significant and can result in individuals developing depression, chronic anxiety or stress, or even post-traumatic stress disorder. The other thing that is also significant for Black youth in particular is that long-term effects of discrimination may result in lower self-esteem, and it may impact their ability to trust others that are outside of their community. And so while we know that there are these long-term and short-term effects, more than anything, it's important to recognize that racism not only hurts feelings, but it also hurts individuals' minds, their bodies, and their futures. And so it is important to help children to build resilience through emotional support and providing a safe environment. So I talked a little bit about some of the broad psychological risks resulting from experiencing racism, but it's also important to recognize that there can be something that's referred to as racial stress. This is a question that I've gotten a lot over the years in terms of, we know that there may be these negative mental health outcomes, but how do we get to this threshold where it crosses over into what is referred to as racial stress or racial trauma? That is a very difficult question to answer because what we know is that everybody experiences racism differently. And so for one person, it might be a single incident that could result in racial stress or trauma. For another person, it can be multiple incidents or experiences that are required before they reach this level of racial stress or trauma. So I wanted to really talk about that a little bit. In general, when we define what racial stress and trauma is, it is a serious emotional response for children when they encounter being treated unfairly based upon their race, if they are harassed, if they see others being targeted or treated unfairly, for example, in the school system, or it can be witnessing some type of racial discrimination through the media. And so when we think about these experiences as an expert, we want to recognize how encounters of racial discrimination, either directly or indirectly, can impact how children think, feel, as well as how they behave. And so I talked earlier about children, particularly Black children, experiencing racism quite often. One of the things that we know from looking at the research, and for me as a psychologist and also as a researcher, I like data and numbers. And one of the most sort of disheartening things that I've seen in terms of the research is that we know that about 87% or higher of Black and African American youth indicate that they experience at least one incident of discrimination within a year. If we look at some of the more recent data that has been published, we now know that this happens sometimes up to 5 times per day. And so while we may not always talk about these things, or children may not always bring these things to our awareness, we do know that it's happening at a pretty high rate. And so we want to be able to understand how our children may be impacted, but also what can we do to support them. So I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that children may be impacted. And so there are 4 ways that I consider in terms of thinking about how Black children may be impacted by racial discrimination. So children can be impacted emotionally, cognitively, behaviorally, and socially. So if you think about emotionally, this is basically how children feel. And so discrimination can lead children to feel sad, they can feel angry, and over time, this can also lead them to experience low self-esteem or even develop depression. Secondly, cognitively, it can impact how children think. And so when they may experience racial discrimination, they actually may be harder. It may be harder for them to concentrate in the school environment, or they may have difficulties believing in themselves and being motivated, either to perform in school or to have some type of life goal. And so one of the things that I've talked about sometimes with parents is that, yes, sometimes children may struggle within the school system academically, but that's not always related to their ability to not understand the material that they're being taught. Sometimes they may be cognitively distracted by other things that are going on in their environment. And so that is also impacting their ability to be successful within the school setting. Behaviorally, racism can impact how children act. And so when children are under these stressful situations, we may see them be more silent and withdrawn. But some children might also be a little bit more agitated, and they may act out more aggressively because of those experiences as well. The final area that children are impacted is socially. And so this is how they relate to others. So kids that may have experienced racism or witnessed it within the school setting, it could make them have difficulties fostering and developing social relationships. They might also have feelings of being left out depending on the composition of their school. So again, these are just 4 areas that I think are really important to capture when we understand how children may be impacted. If we break this down a little bit further, we can see that these are some additional psychological symptoms or ways that children may experience racial discrimination. So I touched on anxiety a little bit. So they may have constant worries and fears about being treated unfair. But what I've also seen is that sometimes children may be afraid about the safety of their parents. So if the parent is, let's say, stopped by the police, for example, they may have increased anxiety about, is my parent going to be harmed in this particular scenario? Anger and frustration is another thing that may happen. And so obviously, when injustice occurs, individuals are going to be upset about that. One of the things that happens with children is that when this anger is not addressed, it might build up and then they may lash out on others. So either aggressively or they may be more irritable under certain circumstances. Third, children may experience sadness or depression. I like to highlight both of those because for me as a psychologist, I want people to recognize that sadness is oftentimes in relation to a particular context or setting. It tends to be more short term in terms of the emotion going away, whereas depression is much more longer lasting and tends to last weeks or even months. And so we want to recognize that children may have, both or one of those types of emotional reactions. Fourth, as I mentioned before, racism can impact self-esteem. And so individuals may have a lower self-esteem as a result of these experiences. And this often is due to being having these repeated messages of being not good enough or less than. And finally, there may be interpersonal difficulties. And so racism can make it hard for children to trust others, and they may struggle to maintain friendships, or they may feel excluded. So again, I wanted to just sort of highlight these because I do think that when we understand some of these psychological reactions of racism for children, that if you notice any of these changes in your child, I would definitely encourage you to seek out the support that you may need to better understand how to help support your child. And yes, I will talk about, some strategies and tools later today, but I want you to also recognize that that is not intended to be a replacement for therapy. And so the benefits of seeking out therapy is that they can better understand what are these unique experiences that your child may be having, but also what are the best ways to individually support you and your family in terms of navigating these circumstances as well. So before I talk about some of the strategies, I have this quote here that I think is really powerful. Some of you may have seen this quote before. In some circumstances, I've seen where this is also a little bit controversial of a quote as well. This is by Ibram X. Kendi, who is the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist and several other books. But the quote reads, "The opposite of racist is not racist. It's anti-racist." What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequalities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between or safe space of not racist. And so I share this quote because I realize that we're in a time where many people who are good humans sometimes are silent in some circumstances. And in some instances, that may be the result of not knowing sort of what to do or how to respond. But what I encourage people to do is really think about what role can you play in addressing some of these inequities in our society. And that requires either supporting people that are doing this work or being able to decide what is the best way for you to engage in some level of advocacy that is going to help make this society better for all of us. So I want to talk about, what are some ways to help children cope and thrive? That's why probably most of you are here today. But one thing that I find is when we talk about racism and helping children, some parents and individuals are concerned or afraid to engage in this discussion with them about race, racism, their identity, because they don't want to sort of set kids up to be on alert for threats in the environment or to be concerned about how to foster relationships with people who are different from them. And so one thing that I want to point out is that when we avoid having these conversations about race and about racism, it oftentimes can create additional challenges for children. One is that children might have little or no connection with their heritage. They might be more likely to develop a negative self-concept about their own identity. And children may not know how to respond in racially charged situations. And so for me, I think that it's really important to have these conversations with children about race and their identity so that way they can understand who they are and they're not told by others outside of their culture or their identity who they are as an individual. And so when we have these conversations with children, what we know from the research is that children tend to be more respectful of others. They have a better understanding and appreciation for their own race and their own identity. And they tend to have higher self-esteem. And so my call to action for you as a parent or an individual supporting a Black child is that you recognize the benefits of having the race talk, quote unquote, with your child to make sure that they understand why it is important to love themselves, even when society may show them that they're less than or not worthy of being loved. So one way to engage in talking with children about race and their identity is referred to as racial socialization. So this is basically what some people call having the race talk. But more than anything, racial socialization is referring to messages and practices that parents engage in to communicate to a child about their race, about their identity, and about how to navigate society that can be racially charged at times. And so for Black children, racial socialization is really a crucial part of healthy development because it helps to foster resilience, positive self-esteem, and a strong sense of identity. And when we think about addressing some of the negative psychological outcomes that exist, what we know from research is that when children have a strong sense of their racial identity, that helps to buffer or reduce some of the potential negative effects of having these negative racial encounters. So I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the different types of racial socialization. I think that one of the things that comes up for many parents is when we have this quote unquote race talk, it is talking with children about racism and prepare them to navigate racial bias in society. And yes, preparation for bias is one aspect of racial socialization. And that is important because it does help you to talk with children about how to respond if they are treated unfairly within, let's say, the school system or even in a public space. So that preparation for bias can help to put kids on maybe a little bit of alert, but I think it also helps to reassure them that their worth isn't defined by how others treat them. And so really take that message home when you consider how to prepare your kids to live in a racially biased society. Another really important aspect of racial socialization, which I think is really important, is what we refer to as cultural socialization. And so cultural socialization basically is teaching kids about their culture, about their heritage, about history related to their culture, and about their having pride in their racial identity. And so there are a lot of ways to talk about creating cultural socialization with your child, which as was talked about at the very beginning, my book, Raising Resilient Black Kids, touches on that a little bit in more detail and what are some things that you can do for that. But at the basic level, cultural socialization might include, celebrating Black History Month, which you can talk about some of the key figures in Black history and in American history. It can also talk about cultural socialization might also involve, reading books with Black people in it, written by Black authors to talk about the Black experience. And that can also be another healthy way to foster resilience and racial socialization in your child. The last part of cultural socialization that I will talk about is referred to as promotion of mistrust. And so this is warning children to be cautious or mistrustful of people that are not members of their own racial group. And so the main, I would say, goal of promoting mistrust is that, yes, you talk about some of the past histories of, and maybe even present histories of injustice in society, but it also aims to protect kids from different situations. And so I think a really helpful piece of promotion of mistrust is that it teaches kids to think critically about different scenarios, and also to be open-minded and recognize that not everyone will treat them unfairly, but you do want to recognize that sometimes people do treat you unfair. And so I think a really big part of that for me is helping kids to maybe not internalize some of these negative messages that society has about who they are based upon their racial identity. Other things that you want to think about when it comes to talking with children about racism is realizing that you don't have to have all the answers. I think that in my work, many times parents feel like they have to know how to respond to every question that their child has. And so I urge parents to also ask children questions, particularly as it relates to, their race and their identity. And this is helpful because asking children questions provides an opportunity for you to learn from your child how they think about themselves, maybe what messages they've received from others about who they are as an individual based upon their racial identity. And it can also provide an opportunity for you as a parent to maybe address some of the misinformation that exists. I don't know if people saw this. I came across a clip on social media where a parent was talking, I think at a school board meeting, about some information that was incorrect in the textbook. And so by helping her child with a homework assignment, she realized that they were teaching her child some incorrect information about their Black heritage. And so I think those are some really important lessons learned that can be helpful for you as a parent to help your child navigate some of these scenarios. The second point here, I think, is helpful to talk with your child about your own experience. In some instances, I think reflecting on your own experiences can highlight for your child that, yes, mom or dad has experienced some of these difficulties, but we've also been able to figure out how to overcome those challenges as well. And so I think those are really powerful messages that we can send to our children about there may be difficulties that we encounter, but we also want to instill hope in a better future for them as well. And then finally, you can use books as a resource. So again, you don't have to have all the answers. There are a lot of picture books that exist that you can talk with kids about their racial identity, can talk with them about navigating experiences of racial discrimination. And so use those as resources as well, because you can then, pick up a book, read it with your child, and ask them questions to reflect on those stories as well to better help them understand how to overcome some of those scenarios. Another really important piece that can be helpful to build resilient kids is teaching your child to be anti-racist. And so one thing that I talk a lot about with parents is the benefits of modeling good social behaviors. And so we know that children are like little sponges. I'm sure for many of you, you've recognized for your kids that they take in a lot of information, sometimes things that you don't necessarily verbally communicate to them. And so the same thing happens with teaching kids to navigate injustice in society. And so by modeling how to confront some of these things for your child, that provides them a space to learn how to also navigate these really difficult situations and circumstances. Secondly, it's really important to teach kids how to speak up about injustice. And so we know that children spend a lot of time within the school setting. Sometimes that can make it really difficult for them to speak out because they're going to have to see these kids or even teachers on a daily basis. And so they may be uncomfortable to speak out about some of this injustice. And so it's really important for you to work with your child to identify who is someone that they trust, that they can talk with about these issues when they do occur, and who can they seek out some support to help them address and navigate some of these experiences if they are being discriminated against or if they are experiencing some type of a racial hate within the classroom. And then finally, we know that it's helpful to also encourage children to have relationships with peers that are different from them. And so one of the things that we know from the research on looking at anti-racism is that when children are encouraged to have friendships with peers that are different from them, that helps to dismill myths about someone's culture or identity. It also helps to reduce the likelihood of engaging in racist behaviors by others. And so that's a really important thing that we want to think about is that, yes, it can be helpful to have friends with peers that look like you, but also having peers that look different from you can also be another way to address some of the injustice that occurs within society. The other thing I want to touch a little bit on is about, when we talk about doing something and sort of stepping in, I've seen where some parents have some hesitance around engaging in activism or taking their child to engage in activism with them. So if that, looks like going to a protest or a rally, we know that history shows us that at times these things may become hostile. And so I think it's rightfully so that parents might be concerned about taking their child to some type of event. And so one of the things that I encourage parents to think about is trying to identify what activism would look like for you and your child. It doesn't always have to be like attending a protest or a rally. Sometimes activism might include calling your politician or writing a letter. And so if you sit with your child to help them craft a letter to talk about experiences that are happening in their communities or in their schools and submit it to a politician, those are the types of stories that can be really impactful and influence some of their decision-making around some of the policies that they put forward for our country and for our communities. Other ways that activism can look like might include donating to a cause or an issue, or it might involve creating your own campaign. And so maybe there's a way that you and your child can, create a campaign where you're talking about history of Black figures and how they've contributed to society in many different ways. That can be something that you can also utilize as ways to engage in critical consciousness or some forms of activism as well. And then the other really important piece that I like to talk about is as a parent raising a child, you do want to take care of your own mental health. And I think sometimes as a parent, and I've seen it in many cases with clients that I've worked with in the past, is that you're so focused on your child and their well-being that you don't take care of yourself. And so obviously we've heard the saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. And so you do need to take care of your own mental health as a parent before you navigate some of these challenges with helping your child to cope with this as well. And so one of the things that I talk about often with parents is, one, it is okay for you to prepare to have these conversations or prepare to have the race talk, for example. Part of that may be, how do you take care of your own emotions before you actually engage in that conversation? We know that a lot of things are happening in society. And so if you're emotionally tapped out, it's going to be really difficult for you to be present for your child to talk about some of these issues and concerns that you want to help them to navigate. It's also necessary that you engage in self-care before and maybe after you're having some of these conversations with your child about their race and about their identity. And so taking care of yourself is really important so that you have the emotional capacity to be able to navigate these circumstances for you and for your child. And then the last thing that I'll say around this is taking care of yourself also is a way to model healthy coping for yourself and for your child. And so if your child sees that, my parent takes time to engage in meditation or to go for a walk to de-stress or, monitor what they're eating, et cetera. Those are going to be habits that they're also going to pick up on as an individual. So that's a really important tool that can help you to support your child as well. So I want to share just a couple of additional resources. For copyright issues, I can't, share all of the book, but this is a page from the book that is one of the free resources that the publisher provides on their website. And so I talked a little bit about self-care. One thing that I think we've commercialized the idea of self-care where it has to be going to a fancy restaurant, taking a vacation, going to the spa, getting your hair and nails done, getting a haircut. And that's great, but those are also things that you can't necessarily do on a daily basis. And so for me, self-care is also what are the things that I can do daily to help myself to manage my well-being. And so figure out what are the things that you can do, whether it's, taking 5 minutes to, do a mindful meditation. There's a lot of apps and, things on the internet to help you to be able to do that. Do you take time to just be present with yourself? Read a book for fun. Those are some things that can help you to manage your mental health as well. I've overviewed some of the strategies and tips today for people who need something that's a little bit more skills-based. I did just want to highlight the book to the degree that if you want something that's going to walk you through some of these activities with you and your child a little bit more, that is one of the reasons I created this resource. And so there are a lot of different activities that can be helpful for you. I won't walk through all of these individually, but I think, for those that find benefit in journaling, for example, that can be a way to get the thoughts out. It can be a way to help your child, talk about what are some of the experiences that they've had, at school that week. For people who have difficult knowing where to start when you have this conversation with your child about their race, about their identity, I created a list of conversation starters. So what are ways that you can even engage in starting this conversation with your child? For me, one thing that I think is really helpful is to just ask your child, what does it mean to you to be Black? That's a really great starting question to get a sense about how they view themselves and maybe what messages they've received from society about who they are. Also in the book, there are a number of different activities in terms of breathing exercises that you can go through with your child. There's activities about how to foster racial pride and to walk through the racial socialization process in a little bit more detail. There's also a list of resources that I provided in terms of book suggestions, as well as movies. So I think, sometimes it can be really difficult to know how to have these conversations with your child. We know that books and movies are a great way to sort of give children sort of this visual and then be able to talk about it with them. And so I think, for those that find it difficult, to know which movies do I use from, which movies are safe, I try to curate a couple of ideas for you. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive list, but just a couple of ideas that might be helpful for you. This is also another example of a sample worksheet that's provided on the free website. So again, I think checking in with you and your child about how you experience racism can be helpful to also know, what do I do to manage this? So if I'm feeling tense in my body, then maybe it's helpful for me to do some type of body scan activity to help to remove some of that stress. So maybe I want to go for a walk, or maybe I want to dance, if that's something that I like in terms of movement. and how that can be helpful for your emotions and your mental health as well. And so as we sort of wrap up with the slides and open it up for questions, just want to again summarize that we know Black youth are experiencing racism at a pretty high rate, sometimes up to 5 times per day, and that there are these huge psychological impacts that impact them emotionally, cognitive, behaviorally, and socially. But again, the good news is that resilience and racial socialization can be really helpful to help your child cope with these situations, but also thrive in the future. So I want to share just a couple of additional resources really quickly with you. If you want to visit the Therapy for Black Kids website, on there we have a parenting resource center. So if you click on the parenting tools tab, you'll see a curated list of book recommendations for you. We update that list fairly often. If you see, if you have book ideas, we're happy to add things, so you can also email us and we can add those to the list. And then there are a couple of additional resources that you can see posted as well on the website. This is a website from the American Psychological Association. So for those that may be interested in, ways to engage in having the race talk or having healthy conversations about race, this is also a really helpful resource that is pretty useful as well. It has a lot of information and have some tools that you can also walk through to have these conversations with your child. And then another resource is the Info About Kids website. So it doesn't talk specifically about racism, but there are a number of different areas that could be helpful in terms of youth well-being that can also be helpful to support you and your child. And then finally, just a couple of additional book resources here. In terms of across the age spectrum, I know for teens that may be dealing with this, there's also ways that, if they are able to work through these things on their own, there's a book for that some colleagues of mine have written. And then if you yourself maybe wanted to sort of process some of your own racially charged experiences, there's a racial healing handbook that can provide some additional tools and resources as well. If there are professionals that are here that may also find benefits in, engaging in culturally sensitive practices, these are a couple of different resources that I shared here. And then lastly, I just want to thank the Parent Venture for hosting this event tonight and for having me to share with all of you. So if anyone wants to reach out to me again, my contact information is posted here on this slide. I turn over to Charlene.
Well, thank you, Dr. Earl, for that really brilliant discussion. Wow, you packed a lot into 45 minutes. We are impressed, and so is our audience. Very impressed. Everyone wants the links, and they want the book, and they want everything. So that is great news. We will be sure to send out the links that you have posted and the ones that we've included in the chat today when we send out your video. So we have a few minutes and some really, really great questions. So let's, with your permission, just have at it, okay?
Okay.
Here we go. First question, really good one. What if your kids aren't aware that they're experiencing discrimination? Should I be raising my kids' awareness?
That's a really great question. So I think that if you don't think that your kids have experienced it, or maybe you don't know that they've experienced it because they haven't communicated it to you, I would say that you don't necessarily want to put them on alert. So when I talked about preparing them for bias, I mean, you may be a little bit cautious about that. Obviously, the Black community is not a monolith, and so people have very different experiences. And so I think, depending on where your child is developmentally and based upon their age, they may not have had any problems. So I think, focusing in on like the cultural socialization practices about their own culture and identity may be that starting point is where you want to go. And then if there are incidents that happen, then there can be those sort of lessons learned or teaching opportunities where you can then talk about those issues with the child. So I do think that it is, there is no one right way to raise a Black child, as, one of my colleagues has said. And so I do recognize that. And so I think if your child hasn't communicated these things to you or you're unaware, of these things happening, let's say in the school system, for example, then I wouldn't necessarily want to like now put my child on alert to be like looking out, for those things. I would maybe focus in on the cultural socialization pieces.
Okay. We have a couple questions about that, actually, Dr. Earl. So again, these are good questions, tough questions. How do schools honor cultural socialization when these kinds of conversations are being banned?
Yeah. So I think that is the challenge right now, is that many schools are not having these conversations. The other piece that I sometimes, I guess, throw out there to parents is, in reality, would you want your school to be teaching your child about their identity? And so I think it's sort of two sides of the coin, so to speak. And so I think when schools aren't talking about, let's say, they've removed Black history in some instances from schools, for example, that how do you now talk about these historical moments and contributions that Black people have made, to our country in a lot of different ways, in your home environment. So again, there can be book resources that can be available. I know there's a lot of museums. Oftentimes, museums are free, that you can take your child to expose them to some of this history and culture. So those can be other ways that you can foster some of this history in your child as well.
That's a really good point. Might be time to download some of the videos from the African American History Museum
Yes, absolutely.
because we don't know.
Yes, we're this is, I would say, at least in my lifetime, this is one of the few moments where we're living in a instance where we're like figuring things out as we go, because there is so much uncertainty.
Yeah, so true. Again, a lot of really good questions. So here we go. You had mentioned this. The writer asks, at what age would you start engaging in racial socialization and discussing the harder topics? And is there any guide to help lead those conversations?
Yes. So the part about starting the conversation is a question that I get often, and actually, there's a segment in my book that where I talk in detail about that. But one of the things that we know is that kids actually learn about race and about racial differences quite early. So as early as age 4, children begin to recognize racial differences. So I would say that you can start at about age 4. We're talking with kids about this. Obviously, you want to talk about it in a sort of age appropriate way. But I think at age 4 is a good time where we know kids begin to recognize, some of these racial differences. In terms of like starting points, I mentioned the APA website as one of the resources. They have some tools on there in terms of like conversations that you can begin to have with your child about sort of race and their identity. Also, as I mentioned in the book, there's a whole chapter that talks about racial socialization, and also walks parents through what are some ways to engage in that conversation. And one of those I think is also helpful for parents too, is to like reflect on your own race and identity, and like what messages were you taught as a child about your own identity. And that can help you then begin to think about, what do I want to now have my child learn about their own race and about their identity.
Yeah, and as you say, some books, especially for children, are really good. I sent my grandkids Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist Baby. It's a great book to start with.
Yes.
I mean,
The good thing I think in the last couple of years that there have been a lot more books that have come out about these things, because we know that parents are interested in learning like how to help support their child.
yeah, so we have just a few minutes, but this question I think is really important because there's a number of them about what schools can do. So this writer says, I'm an administrator at a school, but my daughter goes to a different school. How can I advocate for there to be conversations about Black history who's in TK without feeling like I'm overstepping? So people really want to know, what can parents do to engage the schools to keep these conversations going?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I would definitely encourage, PTAs to maybe have this conversation. I think that's a great opportunity to have some ongoing discussions about these issues, or to have, people come in to talk with the PTA about some of these issues. So I think those can be one ways that parents can sort of help support their schools. I would also say, if you go into it directly to administrators, I think, depending on the administrator, it may be a very different scenario, but I think that's obviously one way to at least highlight these things. And so going to the principal to say, I'm really concerned. And so what are the ways that we can sort of, support our kids and support our families in our school?
Absolutely. All right. So here, last question, Dr. Earl. How can non-Black parents and educators become better allies in creating inclusive and affirming environments for our kids?
Yeah, so I sort of talked about this a little bit in terms of like the silence that sometimes exists. And so I think one of those is not being silent. I think one of the things that is a challenge is like we all feel uncomfortable about this. And sometimes we have to deal with that discomfort that we experience. And part of that is speaking up in a scenario where for a Black parent that may sort of speak up about this, they may not be heard by the school administrator, for example. But for a non-Black parent, if they bring up this issue to the school, they might be much more receptive to listen, to that parent. And so that's unfortunate. But I think those are some of the ways that, parents can sort of work together and support others and support their schools in addressing some of these issues that they may be experiencing.
Exactly. And parents, I started this program 19 years ago under the umbrella of the PTA, but I'd been in education my whole life. So that's why we're here today with people like Dr. Earl Turner, real experts in this. Use this video, share it with your schools, show it to parents, show it to PTAs. That's what we hope for. And we just thank you so much, Dr. Earl, for being with us today. Last question, because we have to ask, we always do. Given everything we're under today and all the stuff that is happening, what gives you hope?
I think the thing that gives me hope is really thinking about the people that came before me. And so I think for me, as someone in this field, and that has been supported by a number of, psychologists that have been doing this work for decades, is for me to reflect on like, we've been here before, unfortunately. And so I think that we have overcome some of these challenges and circumstances that many of my ancestors have died for. And so just being hopeful that, we can overcome these challenges if we all work together. And so that is what gives me hope.
That is a beautiful answer, Dr. Earl, and we're going to end on that. So again, thank you, everybody. We really hope that you will pick up Dr. Earl's new book, Raising Resilient Black Kids. But this conversation has been for everybody. We are so grateful.
Thank
So
you so much for having me.
thank you. And everybody who's been with us today, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Do share, we'll send this video out to you. Do share it widely. Thank you, Shanice. We couldn't have done it without you. Take care, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.